Something historic and deeply destabilizing is unfolding in Iran, and this time the threat Tehran fears most is not coming from abroad, but from its own streets. Across cities and provinces from Tehran to Rasht and beyond, mass protests have erupted, the largest wave of unrest in years, and they confront the regime with an existential crisis unparalleled in decades. What began as protests over economic collapse and rising living costs has grown into nationwide demonstrations demanding fundamental political change, and in response, Iranian authorities have unleashed a brutal security crackdown that has left thousands dead and tens of thousands arrested. As U.S. military forces position deeper in the region and tensions between Tehran and Washington intensify, the internal turmoil in Iran may be pushing the country toward a confrontation it has long feared, a breakdown of order at home that coincides with growing pressure from outside. On 28 December 2025, protests first broke out in the heart of Tehran's Grand Bazaar after a sharp crash in the rial and a spiraling economic crisis drove merchants and shopkeepers into the streets. Within days, demonstrations had spread across Iran's 31 provinces, from Kermanshah and Alborz to Mashhad and Qom, and evolved into chants against not just economic mismanagement, but political repression, corruption, and the Islamic Republic itself. What began with shop closures and localized anger rapidly transformed into a mass movement that shook cities, university campuses, and working-class neighborhoods. It became something far greater than its initial causes. It became a nationwide demand for dignity, rights, and systemic change. Tehran's worst fear is not merely crowds in the streets. It is the spread of a protest movement so broad and deep that it outstrips the ability of security forces to control it. Security forces, including the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, IRGC, Basij militias, and police units, have responded with lethal force previously unseen in modern Iranian history. According to human rights groups and verified eyewitness accounts, security forces opened fire on demonstrators in dozens of cities, frequently targeting heads and torsos with live ammunition and prohibited weapons, resulting in mass casualties. During the peak of the protests on 8 and 9 January 2026, widespread crackdowns in cities like Rasht reportedly turned markets into killing fields, with dozens and perhaps hundreds of protesters shot and killed as security forces moved aggressively to disperse crowds. International human rights monitors have documented evidence of extrajudicial killings, and organizations estimate that thousands have died, with death toll estimates varying widely, some placing casualties far higher than official figures. This kind of repression, described by human rights groups as one of the deadliest crackdowns in decades, has not quelled dissent. In many places, it has inflamed it. In Tehran and beyond, funerals for fallen protesters have become new sites of defiance, with families and communities turning mourning into protest through music, chants, and public defiance of state narratives. Meanwhile, strikes by students, teachers, medical workers, and civil society activists continue despite the risks, amplifying the sense that this is not a temporary flare-up, but a structural rupture between society and the state. Tehran's leadership has attempted to stem the tide through both violence and legal repression. Internet blackouts were imposed to limit the flow of information and hinder coordination among dissenters. Medical professionals treating the wounded have faced arrest and intimidation, while detained protesters are reported to be at risk of further violence or even extrajudicial execution. High-profile dissidents, including internationally known activists like Nobel laureate Narges Mohammadi, have been sentenced to lengthy additional prison terms, underscoring the regime's determination to suppress opposition even as internal pressure mounts. This domestic upheaval intersects dangerously with international tensions. U.S. military forces have surged forward in the broader Middle East, and Iran is already under intense scrutiny from Washington, not only over its regional policies and nuclear ambitions, but also in response to the brutal repression of protesters. The U.S. has imposed additional sanctions targeting Iranian oil exports and shadow shipping networks even as indirect talks continue in the region, and military planners remain on high alert. For Tehran, the combination of internal revolt and external pressure represents a strategic nightmare. The regime fears being squeezed from both sides simultaneously. The psychological impact of rising protest within Iran on the regime's calculus cannot be overstated. In previous waves of unrest, such as the Woman Life Freedom movement that surged after the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022, security forces ultimately managed to suppress dissent using lethal force, arrests, and systematic repression. But the current wave is broader, more sustained, and rooted in a convergence of economic collapse, social inequality, and political grievance. Protests now include not just traditional opposition groups, but large swaths of society: students, workers, medical workers, and ordinary families. Some analysts suggest that the sheer scope of the unrest may indicate deeper structural cracks within the institutional fabric that supports the clerical regime. Reports of discontent within the ranks of elite security units, including peeling loyalty and even resignations among some IRGC personnel, have surfaced, hinting at the possibility that the regime's capacity to maintain order could be strained beyond its expectations. Whether these signs represent isolated cases or an emerging trend is difficult to verify, but they are symptomatic of the stress placed on the Iranian political system by widespread public anger. The human toll of the protests extends beyond those killed in the streets. Thousands have been detained, students have been arrested en masse, families have lost loved ones, and entire communities are living under fear of further crackdown. Hospitals have struggled to cope with the wounded, and in some cases, medical staff have been targeted simply for providing treatment to injured demonstrators. The emotional and psychological scars of this era of unrest are likely to last long after any particular confrontation ends. Tehran's vocal rhetoric in response to the unrest has been carefully crafted to avoid signaling weakness to adversaries abroad while seeking to consolidate control at home. Officials have blamed foreign interference and claimed that protesters are being manipulated by external forces, even as they attempt to criminalize dissent and deny accountability for the scale of violence inflicted on their own people. This narrative serves a dual purpose. It seeks to justify repression internally while preempting criticism of the regime's handling of the crisis. But for many inside Iran, the narrative rings hollow in the face of lived experience, and the regime's legitimacy erodes further with each new report of brutality or systemic injustice. Internationally, Tehran also faces a precarious position. Wall Street Journal reporting notes that protests have intersected with rising tensions between Iran and the United States over regional conflicts, sanctions, and military postures in the Persian Gulf. US and allied diplomats have warned of consequences for ongoing human rights abuses, and the broader geopolitical climate remains fragile, with competing powers watching and waiting to see how events unfold. Some experts caution against simplistic narratives of imminent regime collapse, emphasizing that the Islamic Republic has historically shown resilience even under extreme pressure and retains institutional controls that it uses to weather crises. Others argue that the combination of economic hardship, demographic shifts, widespread public anger, and relentless state violence creates a uniquely combustible situation that challenges the regime's traditional stability. Whatever the case, Tehran's current predicament, facing mass protests that cut across social strata, met with brutal force at home and intensifying pressure from abroad, represents one of the most acute crises in the country's recent history. The regime's fear of escalation is not abstract. It is the fear that internal upheaval and external hostility could converge, overwhelming the state's ability to control events in a way that safeguards its power and territorial integrity. The protests have not abated. They have grown in scope and intensity. Funeral gatherings for those killed have themselves become acts of resistance, celebrations of defiance that reject imposed narratives of piety and repression. Calls for accountability, justice, and, for some, wholesale political transformation continue to echo through the streets of Iranian cities. Iran's ruling elite faces a dilemma. Cracking down harder risks further alienating the population and deepening the crisis. Stepping back could embolden protesters and signal weakness. As long as mass protests continue to erupt, and as long as the international spotlight remains trained on Tehran's response, the potential for escalation, socially, politically, and geopolitically, remains high. The regime's worst fear is not simply unrest. It is losing control of the narrative, losing the monopoly on violence, and losing the confidence of its own people at precisely the moment external pressures mount from US, regional powers, and global opinion. In the coming weeks and months, the world will watch not just how Tehran responds to the masses in its streets, but how it navigates the dangerous intersection of domestic rebellion and international tension. Whether this crisis leads to a drastic transformation of Iranian society, a hardening of autocratic repression, or an entirely unforeseen outcome, one thing is certain: Iran is confronting its worst fear, a populace rising in unison against the system that has governed for decades, at the very moment when external pressures are higher than they have been in many years.